Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Payne, and I'm a Senior Enterprise Pre-Sales Engineer here at Kaspersky. Today I'll be talking about the effects of dwell time and its impact to the bottom line. I'll go through a real attack scenario and an incident response example, and lastly do a deep dive into the product walkthrough. Alright, so let's get started. Sony, Equifax, SolarWinds. All are breaches that we've heard about over and over again in the news. But what do all these attacks have in common? They all had adversaries who were able to breach the corporate network and were able to gain access and then move around undetected for a long period of time. There is no question that any of these companies could have benefited from early detection. In fact, some of the companies had evidence of early activity, but either they were missed or they were not prioritized correctly until much later on when it was too late and the damage was already done. So when you're thinking of defending your business against cybersecurity threats and breaches, the key to success is timely detection to adversarial activity. We all know it's not if someone can or will break in. In fact, more and more security analysts manage their infrastructure under the assumption you have already been breached. And once you accept this fact, you can turn your focus on finding and neutralizing these threats early before major damage can be done. And speaking of damage, in the past several years, we have been seeing a significant increase in the number of breaches and the costs associated with them. The recent IBM data breach report listed the average overall cost of a breach jumped from $1.4 million in 2019 to over $3.8 million in 2020. This will include all the costs associated with the breach, of course, the damage itself, the reputational damage, the cost of cleanup, cost of extra resources for investigation and incident response, and so on. Attacks are becoming more and more sophisticated and have devastating impact both short-term and long-term. Now, these breaches are using more elusive and evasive techniques, and lately, they are using more and more common administration tools against you. And when adversaries can use common admin tools, endpoint security rarely detects their activities. Another impact to the bottom line is the requirement of having skilled staff who has the experience and the expertise on how to find these threats and then know what to do about neutralizing them. So what are we talking about when we talk about evasive threats? Evasive threats are not the traditional common run-of-the-mill commodity threats. Those are easy enough to prevent and detect, right? We are talking about the more advanced threats, the ones that are difficult and hard to detect. Recently, most companies had to move to a work-from-home model whether they wanted to or not. This makes the endpoints even more appealing to adversaries because the endpoint devices are no longer behind the corporate firewall. And this makes the endpoints an easy target, more than ever before. An adversary typically will take the path of least resistance, going after these easy targets. Once they get in with some type of phishing attack or other entry point and take advantage of your tools, then they can sit in silence. Then they can quietly explore the network and really entrench themselves inside your infrastructure. They have the ability to watch standard communication and activities of all users and admins, so they know how to move around undetected without triggering any endpoint security alarms. We talked about total overall cost of a breach. Here we can take a look at the average cost of a breach related to the amount of time to detection. According to our recent incident response report, the cost of an early detection can have a huge impact. Cost of breaches that took longer than a week to detect were 32% greater than if they were identified and responded to in a timely manner. And this is just a week. The IBM report said that the overall average cost to identify and contain are when adversaries are in your environment for almost a year. And these are cases of a successful attack. Of course, if you could detect and remediate a threat before any major impact was done, then this number is significantly lower, approaching zero cost, which is what we hope to strive for. We are even seeing cyber insurance vendors requiring their customers to have more ability than just endpoint. Now they're requiring tools such as EDR solutions or even managed threat hunting service. I mentioned legitimate tools before. Almost a third of all attacks use legitimate tools. Tools like PowerShell and PSExec are at the top of the list. Now, these are very common tools, right? Tools that most admins will use every day, and they can save an enormous amount of time. So they can't just be blocked or not allowed to run. Admins have to use them. And if you wanted to see the breakdown in those specific tools for those incidents and map them to MITRE, here they are. We mentioned PowerShell and PSExec. Actually, sysinternal tools are used all over the place. Other tools like Advanced Port Scanner, Nmap tools, as well as Process Hacker, and many others. So you have a few options to help reduce the MTDD, or the mean time to detection. You can do it yourself by using a product or products designed to seek out adversarial activities and then hire the right experienced analysts, or you can get help from the top threat hunters who know how to seek out indicators of access, or IOAs, in your environment. Which brings us to Kaspersky Optimum Security Solution. This solution comprises three components: Kaspersky Threat Hunting Service, Endpoint Detection and Response Optimum, and Endpoint Security for Business. Now I'll break these down in the next few slides. Kaspersky Threat Hunting is a 24/7 monitoring service which identifies early adversarial activities and generates incident alerts based on severity and priority. Guided response and detailed reports help break down what was identified and, more importantly, what you should do about it. This, of course, reduces the high cost of added tools or expertise, which reduces the mean time and the cost of incident response. EDR Optimum provides a simple tool for investigation by giving the administrator more visibility into the existing threats in the form of incident cards. Now, where the admin can review detailed telemetry data about a threat, run indicators of compromise scans, and respond quickly to threats like device isolation or execution prevention rules. And of course, our multi-layered endpoint security product, with its advanced machine learning components like behavioral analysis, which seeks out abnormal behavior like ransomware, and exploit prevention, which identifies malicious actions such as zero-day threats. This helps to stop up to 90% of the common malware attacks. And endpoint security has built-in hardening controls. Tools like application control, web control, device control, all of which help reduce the attack vector. So again, these three components make up a solution which identifies early threat activity, gives visibility into threats, and allows quick and immediate response actions, all on top of one of the best endpoint security solutions with the highest detection ratio among its competitors. Okay, so starting with threat hunting, we're going to give you an example of a recent incident we worked on. Now, this is a real attack happened by a customer recently. Kaspersky was called in to do an incident response and investigation on day 150. And of course, with IR, you always work your way backwards from the day you start. So we will start with day 150. At this time, there were hundreds of servers which had already been compromised and were full of malware. The customer's administrators had been feverishly trying to remove malware, but every time they got one clean and moved on to the next one, the first one was reinfected. They just couldn't keep up. After doing some digging, the IR team was able to identify that about 26 days prior to the incident response, or day 124, someone installed cryptocurrency mining tools on numerous servers by using remote execution and malware. Day 124 is actually the same day that the customer realized something was going wrong in their environment. They started to see all their servers were consuming way too many resources, and there was major service degradation. And then after the customer discovered that there was cryptocurrency mining tools installed, they decided to implement application lockdown rules preventing any further execution or installs. Day 122, just a few days before, there was evidence of testing common passwords and searching for common vulnerabilities to exploit. Now, this must have worked because with the accounts with domain admin permissions disabled security software on several servers. Day 120, new malware was being distributed, but was using the same method as day 1. And way back on day 1, which was a full 150 days before an incident response action was initiated, Endpoint Security detected a password brute force attack and also detected and neutralized the very first initial malware. Weak passwords were also used and identified to move throughout the network. So now let's take a look at how threat hunting services would have responded. For now, let's assume the customer decided not to take any recommended actions. They only wanted to be notified. Well, on day 1, the threat hunting service would have determined that just because a brute force attack attempted and a neutralized malware detection happened, it didn't mean that the adversary was stopped at the door. In fact, a weak password was guessed and they were still able to gain access to the system. This would have been mapped to 3 MITRE techniques: initial access, execution, and credential access. And if you don't know what MITRE framework is, it's a comprehensive matrix of tactics and techniques used by threat hunters, red teamers, and defenders to better classify attacks and assess an organization's risk. So organizations can use this framework to identify holes in the defenses and then prioritize them based on risk. An incident alert would have been generated for this compromise with a high severity level and detailed recommendations on what to do. The customer would have been able to review all the alert details and have direct integration into the MITRE framework site for each technique that was used, which would have been able to give them background on this technique and the tools that it commonly uses and ways to prevent this in the future. Day 120, when new versions of the malware were uploaded using the same method, a related event would have been added to the same incident. All incident history is kept for 1 year. Again, it would have been mapped to an execution technique, and the customer would have been notified with recommended actions. Day 122, MITRE discovery, collection, and lateral movement techniques would have been added when signs of scanning for the similar passwords and common vulnerabilities happen. Day 124, MITRE execution, command and control, and collection techniques are identified. Remember, it was at this stage that the customer realized that these systems had cryptocurrency tools installed on them, and they wanted to implement the application lockdown rule to prevent any further installs of the software. So somewhere along the way of day 124 up to day 150, at this point, the adversary was no longer able to install its mining tools. So now they're ticked off and they wanted to leave. But before leaving, they decided to launch a massive malware campaign and cripple all the customer servers. Here, the MITRE impact technique would have been added to the relevant details. Of course, at any point in time, if the customer would have taken the recommended action steps, they could have prevented the attack from going on to the next stage before any real damage was done. Okay, so let's walk through some of the components and see what they look like. I'm actually going to skip over endpoint security. We've all seen plenty of presentations on that. So let's focus on Kaspersky threat hunting. Inside the Security Center web console, underneath monitoring and reporting on the left, you have an incident tab, which of course lists out all the incidents. You can do a search, you can sort by status, or filter out incidents based on severity. Each incident has its own unique identifier. The next column, you can see the severity the analyst set, whether it was low, medium, or high. A status column to let you know if you have a new open incident or on hold or resolved and closed. The updated column will first list out when the incident was created, but then if the incident is later updated, it'll reflect the updated timestamp. Now, which all assets were identified in this incident? Again, endpoint security installed on a single device only knows about itself. With the threat hunting service, we can do cross-endpoint correlation to identify if multiple machines are involved in the same attack. Next, a short description of what this incident is, and lastly, the different MITRE techniques used. When you go into the incident, you can see a summary, priority, and status, but also more description on what the overall recommendations we have for this incident. In this case, the description says, it is recommended to check the legitimacy of this activity and, if needed, isolate this host and initiate incident response procedures. So this one sounds pretty serious. We integrate directly into the MITRE framework website so the user can bring up detailed information about this tactic or technique that was used during this incident. And during this incident, there was a Kaspersky endpoint security detection that was discovered, but that is not a requirement here. It's not a requirement to create an incident. Incidents can be created for a number of different reasons. On the right, there is an action section where you can do things like close the incident, export all the assets involved, or send the incident to an email in a PDF format. Now, if you scroll down into the details, it'll list out all the actions that were discovered. In this case, 1:37 p.m. on March 19th, the service detected a suspicious OS system info gathering script, which was detected on win1001.abc.local domain. The name of the file was getinfo.bat, and it was piped to a text file in the temp directory. Now, all these commands that were executed are part of the batch script are documented. Now, you might recognize some of these or all of these. These are very common commands ran by any Windows system administrator. Executed on their own might not seem suspicious at all, even if you ran a few of them on their own. But this number of commands could indicate a type of network discovery or recon type action. Notice that at the same time, a scheduled task was created on this computer with the task name of software updates. Some of you may know that there really isn't a task called software updates, but it sure sounds like it could be legitimate, or an attempt of someone trying to make it look like it was a legitimate task. The command execution is the same command that was executed manually, and it was executed by ABC Tom. The Assets tab will contain all of the devices that were involved with the incident, and you can click on each one and it'll bring you up to the computer device properties where you can review events, tasks, and incidents, and so on. Down at the bottom of the incident page, you'll have a detailed list of all IOCs or indicators of compromise for this incident. If you select one, you can create a IOC scan for this one or any of the IOCs to run against all the devices in your environment. And then there is a little export button where you can export to an IOC file. Now, this file can be used with other security tools like SIM systems. There is an MD5 hash listed, which integrates into our free threat intelligence portal at opentip.kaspersky.com. Now, this is just a subset of data from our full-on paid subscription threat intelligence website. The OpenTip is free, and this is where you can search for IPs, domains, URLs, file hashes, things like that. The results will tell you what we classify this file as, whether it's malicious or not. In this case, it looks like malware. You get a breakdown of all the details about the hash, like how many times we've seen it, when was the first time, and when was the last time we've seen it. Also, it lists the different detection names for the same file. Here's another incident marked with high priority, and it was resolved. A malicious file was detected by KES, and the recommended actions was to perform a full AV scan on the host to make sure it removes any malicious files found. And another one with normal priority, but suggests to validate that this is a normal activity. Below, we can see Wireshark was running, right? Which is a common network tool, but adversaries can use this tool to sniff out network traffic. Later on, KES detected both Mimikatz and Metasploit framework tools on a device, which are more commonly likely used by an attacker. I mentioned you can schedule a report by email. This is what one looks like. Same features as the incident card. You can see that the BAT file script doing the recon, a scheduled task was created. Several other events were documented here. Remote registry keys were added. commands written to the current version run key, psexec being executed, creating hacker accounts, and on the right there, some reg hives being dumped, presumably to exfiltrate to crack offline. Last section on the right there looks like they were trying to cover their tracks, right? By wiping the local security log, we're able to identify when these type of activities happen and report them. And a nice feature of the incident is a visual view of a timeline of all the activities from initial discovery all the way through clearing the security log. All right, so that was all about Kaspersky threat hunting. And now we can move on to Kaspersky Endpoint Detection and Response Optimum, which again allows you to gain visibility into the existing threats and to be able to run a response action on them. Now let's take a quick look at the typical incident handling process, which consists of 6 stages. Preparation is getting everything set up and configured to do an incident response. This is more of a pre-stage. Identification is to identify threats to see if they are just standard commodity threats or if they're more advanced threats that require more attention. If a more advanced threat is identified, contain the threat like host isolation or prevention rules, eradicate any remnants including processes or artifacts, device recovery, and then finally lessons learned. This is where we gather up all the information we learned along the way and review to see what are the next steps to strengthening our security posture. So preparation, as I mentioned, this is more of a pre-stage. This is just getting the software set up and configured so you can view all the telemetry data about this detection. The identification stage is where we decide if additional actions are required. Here we might make the decision early on that this detection is a simple, common, everyday threat, and we really don't need to do anything with it. We can consider it resolved and move on to the next one. Or we might make the determination this is a more serious threat and we should investigate further. So let's take a look behind the scenes at a client detection. Here we have Kaspersky Endpoint Security running on a machine. An event happens which generates an alert. Now, if you open up the reports section, you can see that a malicious object was detected and it was blocked. Notice the detection is from the exploit prevention engine, which is part of the advanced threat protection layer. At this point, the standard process is to just send the detection and verdict information up to the Kaspersky Security Center. But with EDRO, all of the additional telemetry data, like all information about process objects, any command lines used, user accounts who started the process, MD5s or SHA-256 hashes, and many others are gathered up and a threat formation chain is created. This chain is then sent up and with the detection and verdict information to the Security Center server where an incident card is created. Over in our new web console, you can see at a high level dashboard showing the threats that were detected. We can see the most frequent type of threats, the most infected devices, or the top 10 users of infected devices. We can also see that there are some devices with critical severity vulnerabilities. Here you can see an incident with View Incident Card, and if you select it, the incident card will pop up. And there's a few sections with it. At the top is the Actions section. This is important to note. We are looking at the details of a successfully blocked detection. The next section is a gray section here, is the threat formation chain. This visually shows the detection itself, its parent's process, its parent's parent's process, and all the little things that it did. Underneath, you have some incident details. Again, this is letting us know that there was a successful detection and block. We can see the date and time. We can see that it's Tom's laptop and what decision was made and what type of object was found. On the bottom are some more details about the process itself. The blue box inside the threat formation chain represents the detection. If you click on it, a pop-up will happen. So let's dig through some of this information. We can see here that a file called bfwitq.exe was executed in a local temp folder. We can see this was launched under the user Tom, and he's currently running with privilege rights. So something to think about here. Should Tom have full access to the system? Or is Tom sitting over in HR? Perhaps his credentials have been compromised. We just don't know yet. Up at the top, we can see a startup parameter was specified. Now, of course, it's not uncommon for applications to have startup parameters, but in this case, I don't know of any legitimate software that has a startup parameter of evil. The time here can be very useful. Right now, the file was caught at 8:15 in the morning. Might not be a big deal, but what if this were to say 1:30 in the morning, for example? Does Tom normally work at 1:30 in the morning? Perhaps that might indicate some type of malicious activity going on in the middle of the night. At the bottom, you can see the hash, and again, this is integrated into our opentip.kaspersky.com portal we just talked about. Early, we saw malicious results, but this time, what did it tell us? Well, it tells us that a reputable threat intelligence provider hasn't really seen or categorized this yet. This could indicate a new, previously unknown threat. Now, back on the incident card, we can take a look at the activity. For example, the process dumped several files on the system. By clicking on it, we can see a complete list of files dropped. Looks like the server files were dropped in the app data folder, and one was written directly to the root of the C drive. You can also click on the injection and network connections to get a list as well. And then we have the register keys. Notice this one here. This is something you're probably familiar with, current version run key, right? That's the key that gets called anytime a computer boots up. Now, adversaries will often inject calls into the registry run key to help maintain a backdoor or to maintain persistence. Again, here we see the file with the evil parameter added. Back on the incident card, we can see the parent process, which is launched from the swtest.exe process. Now, this was launched under Tom again, but Tom does not have any privilege rights. So somewhere along the way, his rights were elevated. And again, no startup parameter here was used. So it appears Tom may have downloaded a malicious file and executed it. With device selection lists built inside of the Security Center, you can build out a list of devices Tom has logged into. Notice he logged on to the domain controller. If Tom had rights to log on a domain controller, he might have the ability to modify domain settings, or just exfiltrate NTDS, which is basically the database for AD, and crack it offline. Also notice that the security application is currently not running on the DC. And since Tom has admin credentials, he might have been tampering with the device properties, which is a common tactic as an adversary would do. Now down here, Win10.01 has a very high count of a number of threat detections. This could signify the adversary's entry point. We can take a look at the applications that are installed on Win10.01. Advanced IP Scanner, Wireshark, Burp Suite, CrackUtil. All of these are legitimate tools and can be used by pen testers. However, they're also commonly used by hackers when they want to scan for devices, capture network traffic, find vulnerability applications and websites, and crack passwords. Finding these tools on a Windows admin computer might be acceptable, but in our case, if Tom's not part of the Windows admin group and Win10.01 is a normal end user's computer, this could indicate a compromised device. Along with the applications installed, we can get an idea if there are any known software vulnerabilities. Here you can see 3 pages worth, including several known exploits for these vulnerabilities. You can find out more information about the known exploits by a direct link here to our Kaspersky Threats website. That's threats.kaspersky.com. And again, this is a free website you can do research on. It'll list out vulnerabilities and exploits that you may find in your environment. We give a complete description of what the vulnerabilities do, what are the affected products, and what the recommended actions to fix them. Any CVEs here, common vulnerability exposures, and links to find out more information about the exploits. So once you've done some research on the vulnerability, back on the device details, you can see that there are updates on the Win10 device, including a critical one for Mozilla Firefox, which if you look will show you that it fixes all of those vulnerabilities that we just looked at. Okay, so what have we found out so far? We have a process that was started with elevated permissions and a starter parameter of evil. The executable has not been categorized yet by a trusted threat intelligence provider. The executable is launching multiple instances and copying itself into different directories. The executable dropped several files, made a few network connections, changed a few registry keys, one that looks meant to maintain persistence. Accounts have been compromised, elevated permissions and lateral movement, and of course, all of this on a highly vulnerable system with known exploits. At this point of the identification stage, it's pretty clear we have much more than a normal commodity threat. We have something far more serious, and we should take immediate action. So let's move on to containment. Now that we believe there is more serious threat going on, we want to perform some actions to contain this threat. We want to isolate the host from the network. We don't want it to spread anywhere else. We want to create prevention rules for this file, and we want to be able to quarantine some suspicious files. Now you might ask, why do we need to create a prevention rule? Endpoint security already detected this threat. And yes, that's true. If endpoint security is installed, it will detect and block this malicious file. But the goal should be catching the detection sooner in the attack chain. The further on down that chain it goes, the more damage it can be done and the more expensive it is to clean up. So rather than waiting until the file is executed, one that we now believe is malicious, we create a rule and prevent the execution from even being able to start. And not only on this particular device, but the prevention rule is placed in a policy which applies to all endpoint devices. Back on the incident card, you have the quick single-click option to isolate this host from the network. All inbound, outbound communication traffic is blocked and prevented from further spread. Next, in the card pop-up, you can create a prevention execution rule with a single click. Here we want to prevent the execution of parent SW test process. This will add a rule to the policy so that all the client devices will pick it up, and when an attempt is made, the file is blocked. Here you can see a list and times of prevented rules and how many times they blocked an execution by the prohibited applications report. Right next to the prevent command is the quarantine button where you can quarantine any of the files that were dropped. Now that we've gone through the containment stage, the next stage is eradication. Here we're going to create an indicator of compromise scan using data generated by the endpoint. And optionally, we can execute remote commands on client devices. For example, if we wanted to remotely delete a file or kill a process, or even run a regserve command and change back a registry key. On the All Incident Event tab, you can selectively choose a single or multiple events and generate an IOC automatically. This will build out an IOC list for you and create a scan task. We can run this task on all devices in our network. And under the action, if we do discover another incident that matches this IOCs, we want to remove it and quarantine it. Inside the results, you can see the devices that the task ran on. We didn't find any matches with the top 4 devices, but the last 2 show IOCs have been detected. We started on Tom's laptop, but it looks like the same detection activities happened over on Alex's laptop as well. This might indicate lateral movement. Now, why is that important? Well, it's very expensive for adversaries to completely retool all their code. So oftentimes they will just reuse their code over and over again, but they only change a few bits and bytes to get around the standard signature analysis detection. In this case, they may have used the same registry key or dropped files, for example. And since we selected remove and quarantine, those files will be removed from devices as well. Once you find an IOC match, you can run remote delete file tasks to purge it from the system. Here we had an artifact file on a C drive, so we can remove it. Just create a new endpoint agent task to delete a file, specify the path, select a device, and execute. The task will purge this file from all devices. Now, once this task has completed, you can see the results. And we can kill a process if it's still running in memory as well. You create an endpoint agent task to terminate the process. You set a path, and just in case, we'll set the exact MD5 hash as well and execute. And the results, the SW test file has been killed. Once the eradication is complete, it's time for recovery. Back in the containment stage, remember we isolated a host from the network in order to prevent the spread of an infection. Now that everything is cleared up, we can remove the host from isolation and put it back on the network. You can view a list of isolated devices by searching for the tag called isolated from network. Select a device and simply disable host isolation inside the device object itself. And note down below, you can set a default timeout for it too. Okay, the last step is where we review all the things we've learned from the incident handling process and see if there's anything that we can take away from it. Patch management. We saw several vulnerabilities listed on Win10.01 device, which have already been known to be exploited, and we know we can fix any of those vulnerabilities by implementing or improving a patch management process. Maybe we need to tighten up our web control rules and explicitly block access to the IP addresses we find in the incident cards. It's probably a good time to review our access controls, right? Remove any unnecessary privileges so that users are not running under admin rights. If we have repeat offenders, they're good candidates for some type of cybersecurity awareness training. Teach them what they should not be clicking on. Perhaps we should add in a mail or web gateway solution, right? Which allows us to block potential threats at the gateway layer prior to even getting down to the devices. And since this telemetry data provides IOCs automatically, we can export a list of IOCs and use them elsewhere outside the environment. For example, our SIM systems. And finally, threat hunting. Maybe we need to look at finding 24/7 monitoring service and bring in automated threat hunting from the experts. So let's wrap up. What does Kaspersky Optimum Security do for you? Well, again, it's all about that timely detection to adversarial activity. Reducing the dwell time can substantially lower the overall cost of a breach by identifying early activity before any major damage can be done. And of course, you can save the cost of having threat hunters and security analysts on staff. And with that, I'll say thank you for listening, and I'll open it up for any questions you might have.